month of July, we're going to be taking up a little bit of a special offering. We normally, most of the special offerings we do, we try to keep them external. We try to focus on, we've got several different organizations we work with that we try to focus on: Manna Food Bank, Waterfront Rescue Mission, Operation Christmas Child. My brain's going. Pensacola Dream Center. There's several organizations that we try to help and promote during the year. However, what we're doing is we're trying to raise, over the next 3 years, our church mortgage gets kicked up to the next round in 3 years' time. And we're trying to, over the next 3 years, raise about an extra $50,000 just so we can knock that thing out once and for all. So what we're doing is in July, I guess we call it our Christmas in July event. And we're just doing a little extra. If you would like to help with that, we're going to be raising a little extra through the month of July to try to knock down just so we can pay down principal on our mortgage. The more we get done of that now, the better it is at the end. So just to let you know that is coming up as well. All right. We started a series dealing with foundational truths. We began to say this: there has got to be some things that as followers of Jesus Christ, we must all be able to see eye to eye on. It is estimated that there are 45,000 plus Christian denominations in the world today. Did you kind of get that number? There are 45,000 plus. In fact, some people put it a little bit less. Some people put it up to 54,000. So I don't know. Somewhere in that range. About 45,000 is the kind of estimated average. But there are 45,000 Christian denominations in the world today. And it is so easy to go, well, if there are 45,000 different denominations and you guys cannot agree as followers of Jesus Christ what is truth and what is not truth, it lets us all off the hook, doesn't it? I mean, nobody can know. And we began to say that as a follower of Jesus Christ, there has got to be some foundational truths that we all must stop and agree on. There are some things that we learned that says we can say, I don't fully understand, and we're just going to kind of shrug our shoulders and say, we'll let God figure that out one day. But there are some foundational truths that we must hold as sacred if we're going to be followers of Jesus Christ. And we began to look at them. And the first foundational truth that we began to look at is a simple one, yet has such high consequences, is this little idea that God is. God is. This little statement must mean that God is more than just a feeling or a force or some kind of atom that holds the earth together. God must be something that sets the standard. God is. And we're going to move on from that today. As we get ready to start, I kind of want to say, for those of you who kind of relate to this little thing that I deal with, this little ADD, I see some of you kind of might know about it. If you're a little ADD like I am, you know there's this problem we have. For those of you who are married to someone who has ADD, you know this all too well. There's this problem that says your brain is working about 5 steps ahead of where your body's at. So it kind of goes like this. If you are driving down the road talking to your wife at the same time as you're supposed to be driving, okay, let's just say I have more than once, my wife will go, it's just, hey, I know where I'm going. I just kind of miss where I'm going because my brain is working in okay. If you're walking down the street with someone who has ADD and they see something across the street, guess what you're likely to do? That street pole that is standing right in front of you as you are walking, you do not notice it because there's something more interesting on the other side of the street. There is more than one person I have about ran over with the shopping trolley or the shopping cart in the grocery store. Because your brain is going, oh. When you're somewhere and you're holding on to one thing, you're studying it, and yet out of the corner of your eye, you see something else. You almost drop this one because I want to get to that one. There's these moments that when you have a little ADD, there are little oopsies and little mistakes you make that are so common. My poor wife has just learned to kind of deal with it after a while. But when it comes to sin, there's a little more to it than an oopsie daisy or a mistake. There is something we're going to deal with today that we call sin that is more destructive and cannot be fixed simply by paying closer attention to your surroundings. You see, oopsie daisies and mistakes can be corrected. You can apologize to the poor person that you ran over with the shopping trolley. I'm really, really sorry. I apologize. You can get your mind and you can work to focus down pretty good, can't you? I mean, we've all made mistakes, and you correct the mistake. And I mean, if you've ever done accounting, you know that a 1 gets turned into a 0 or a 1 gets turned into 4. And with a little bit of work, you can go through and you can find it and fix it, and it's done, and it's all good. But sin, it's deeper than that. It lies within and doesn't get fixed as simply as rubbing it out and correcting. We started last week by saying the first foundational truth that we must all agree on is that there is a God. If God is, then he by very nature of his existence must be the standard. If God is, then simply by him existing, it just simply means that he is the standard. That there is no other thing. If he is God and he exists, then he is the standard. In fact, John describes this standard in John chapter 1, verse 5. He makes it like this: God is light, and in him there is no darkness. God is like a pure white piece of paper with not a dot on it. Peter goes on to remind us that not only is God flawless like a pure white piece of paper, but that this flawless nature that he is, and the fact that he is this standard, we are called to live up to that standard. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, Peter reminds us of this, and he says this: "For the scripture says you must be holy because I am holy." Okay. It is in this moment that we begin to realize we have a slight problem. I have a desire to be good. I have a desire that when I say something, I'm a man of my word. I want to follow through with what I say. I have a desire that when someone meets me, they may not like me, but they at least go, hey, he's a good man. I have that desire. The only problem that I find is that I'm not really as good as I want to be. I find that deep down within my heart, there's this little stuff that lurks. It's like the creature from the Black Lagoon. And the truth is if you were to look inside your heart, you probably find that little creature exists in there too. There's something that lies deep within all of us. And it's not just mistakes and oops. It is called sin. The second foundational truth that we are going to look at today is this. Sin separates. Now, we're going to look at this idea of what sin is in just a moment, but sin separates. Number one, we looked at the first foundational truth we must all agree with, is that God is. And if God is, he is the standard. The reality is, though, is that we know that as we look into our lives, that none of us, no matter who we are, find ourselves to the same standard that God is. To understand sin, we have to start at the very beginning. We were not originally created to be sinners. This idea of this flaw, this thing, that lurks deep within my heart, and the truth is that lurks deep within your heart. You were not created to be that. I was not created to be that. In fact, in the very beginning, we were created to be in the image and the likeness of God. God wanted us, though, to have a relationship with him based on us having a free choice or a will, a desire that we wanted to have a relationship with him of our own will. Yet, in order for us to understand, for him to get to this place of us willingly choosing to love him, he stopped and did something unique. We know the story. In fact, most of us, if you grew up in Sunday school at all, you know the story so well you can just kind of almost quote it in your sleep. You kind of go through it. But we know that in the beginning, we're told that God created man and he created woman and he stuck him in a garden. And we even know what that name was. We even call garden centers after it, don't we? The Garden of Eden. And in this garden, it was a beautiful place. It was a perfect place. And God looked at it and he said, I've created you in my image. I've created you to be like me. And in fact, I'm asking nothing of you. I don't want anything from you. I'm not giving you 10 commandments. I'm not asking you to follow a list of do's and don'ts. I just want one thing. In order to show your love and trust in me, I ask that you just don't eat of the fruit of one tree. It's simple. I mean, how easy is it? I mean, we live by rules that, we don't even know what all the rules are, do we? If you've been married, you know that somewhere in there your spouse is going to let you know what the rules are that you don't know. Your husband's going to look at you and go, what did you just do? Your wife is going to look at you and go, what did you just do? Don't you know the rules? And you go, what rules? Oh, come on now. You know the rules. And you soon learn we've got rules that are just, we don't even know about. But God gave one. Adam, Eve, don't eat of the fruit of that tree. In fact, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 16 and 17, let's just read this together. God says this, but the Lord God warned him, you may freely eat of the fruit of every tree in the garden, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat of its fruit, you are sure to die. The simple request. Can I just say this? There was nothing in and of that tree itself that was awful. In fact, it was probably a very nice tree. The fruit was very edible. It was pretty. Didn't have thorns on it. You see, the idea of that tree was not about the fruit or even that tree. The idea was, I want you to just show your love and trust in me by simply not eating of one tree. But we know the story, don't we? One day Eve was walking through the garden. She met a little serpent, crawled up in the tree saying, come over here. It's a beautiful tree, isn't it? She began to sit there and say, Eve, God is holding something back from you. God knows that there is something so special about this tree that in the day you eat of it, you will be just like him. Come on, Eve. You'll never know until you try it. And so what happened? Eve took the fruit. She ate it. She said, that tasted kind of good, actually. She gave it to Adam. Adam looked at it and said, woman, if you're doing it, I'm going to do it too. And the consequences from that day forward. You see, what Adam and Eve did that day was not simply an oops or a mistake. It was a willful choice to say, God, we think you're holding something back and we want to know what it is. God, you cannot be trusted because you will not let us eat of that tree. In fact, we read in Romans chapter 5, verse 12, Paul reminds us of a little fact that happened that day when he says this. When Adam sinned, sin entered the world. Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. Paul reminds us of two truths. One, we are all born under sin. And two, we choose to sin. You see, there's a sobering reality that what Paul is trying to tell us is that if I was born in Adam's shoes, you know what I would have done? I probably would have had that fruit too. We mentioned earlier, though, that sin was more than just a mistake or an oops. It's more serious. The idea of sin is to willfully miss the mark. The word sin just simply means, you see, we get this idea that sin means evil. And sin is evil because of what it does. But the word sin itself does not mean evil. It does not mean, it just simply means this. It means to miss the mark. If you were today to go out and do target practice, if you were to go out and go down to the rifle range, if you were to get your bow and arrow out, if you were to get your rock and you stick your bottles on the wall and you begin to throw rocks at that bottles on the wall, every time you miss the bullseye, you would sin. To sin means to literally miss the mark. The reality is that when we miss the mark, we willfully miss the mark. Here's the thing. I don't have to try to miss the mark. I do that naturally. Okay, you know this in your own life too, don't you? You don't have to try not to be perfect to realize you're not perfect. It just sort of happens. But to go one step farther, the problem with sin is that we not only miss the mark because we just can't hit the mark, we actually miss the mark because we choose to miss the mark. What do I mean by that? Even in our striving to be good, even though we know there's a standard that we live up to, we kind of settle for a second standard. We know that there is a God standard, but we also know there is a good standard, right? How many of us are happy with good standard versus God's standard? God's standard is hard. Good standard is good. And I willfully go for good other than God. What do I mean? Well, if you're working on good standard, let's say you go through one of our famous fast food drive-thrus. We've all been there, right? You drive up to the window, and the lady says that will be $12.95. So you rip out your billfold. You hand her a 15. You should have how much change? It's $2.95. I should get $2.05 back. And the lady doesn't know how to count, and she gives me $3.05 back. But you are a good person. So what do? You look at that dollar and you go, Excuse me, ma'am, you gave me $1 too much. Because you have a good standard. You know that every time someone cheats someone else out, we pay for it, and it hurts us in the heart. It kind of nails us down, and later we kind of feel that guilt because we know we saw the mistake. So we go, I'm good, and we hand back that dollar and said, ma'am, you gave me too much. And she kind of looked a little puzzled, but oh, okay. And she sticks it in her till, and you move on, and you feel good about it. You ever found out, though, maybe she gives you 50 cents back too much, and the battle begins, it's only 50 cents. It's 50 cents, come on. I'm already out of the drive-thru. I am not going back through the drive-thru to give back 50 cents. This is absurd. But if you have a really, really good standard, what will you do? You'll go park in the parking lot, get out of your car, walk in and say, ma'am, you gave me 50 cents too much. Now, can I go one step farther? What if it's only 1 penny too much? I'm sorry, my good standard is good enough. I'll give back in for 50, but it's a penny. I am not going back in. But what is a God standard? I see pennies on the ground and I don't pick them up. I mean, I could just take that penny and go, well, I'll just throw it on the ground, and I don't see it. What have we done? We have accepted and willfully chose a good standard over a God standard, which says we have done what? We've made ourselves a sinner. We have missed the mark. And we didn't only miss the mark, we knew it and willfully missed the mark. It wasn't evil, was it? It wasn't sit there and just downright awful. I didn't purposely go out to cheat the lady. I just found myself having to make a choice between a good standard and a God standard. And the good standard versus God standard, we run it across the whole board of our lives. It's not just at the fancy drive-through. It's in our word process too. You ever found yourself saying, I'm going to control my tongue? Now, by the way, if you can control your tongue, James tells us you are an amazing man. James says he who can control his tongue is like perfect. Think about it. But I'm going to be a very good person. I'm going to have a good standard, and I'm going to control my tongue. And so I stop, and I don't use the Lord's name in vain. I don't swear because I know that is destructive. It's hurtful. I've got a good standard, and so I'm not going to do it. And we begin to control our tongue. And it's good. Granted, it's good. But what about when you are driving in the car and that yahoo cuts you off down the road? He misses the front end of your car by 4 inches. It starts getting a little harder to be good, doesn't it? And we begin to go, okay, if I'm really good, we begin to weigh up, do I have my kids in the car with me? I'll let the good standard win because I don't want to say some stuff that's inappropriate. So my good standard comes out. If there's no kids in the car and my wife's not there either, it don't matter what I say because no one's going to hear it, right? What if we go one step farther? A good standard. You may be exceptionally good and you may control your tongue there, but what if you got out of the car and you've just experienced that and you go to close the door and your finger gets stuck in the door? Where does good standard versus God standard come? You see, the reality is even in the moment we know we shouldn't say something, we find ourselves with the good standard being good enough and the God standard being, and God reminds us real quickly that good enough is not God enough. In fact, in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, he makes this very clear when he says this, for everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's standard. Now, here's the thing. We already know this. You know that your piece of paper is not pure, white, spotless, because we all have flaws on us. We live in a world of people with flaws on them, and trying to get through our life on a flawless God standard is hard enough when it's just dealing with me, but when I'm dealing with them. The truth is it's not just that we miss the mark. We just make a decision that it's okay to miss the mark. We just come to a place that we say good is good enough. The problem is that with sin, there's always consequences. The problem with good enough is that good enough is never good enough. Sin, no matter how far you miss the mark, whether it is intentional or unintentional, whenever we miss the mark, there are consequences that come with it. First, it has a problem or it has consequences with our relationship with God. Paul reminds us of what the consequences with God are, and he says this. In Romans chapter 6, verse 23, he says this, for the wages of sin is death. This idea of death is not simply physical death. It's that idea of a separation between us and him. It separates us. It causes death to our relationship with him. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 8, Paul goes on to say this, those who only live to satisfy their own sinful nature, and this idea of a sinful nature is just one that goes against God's way or his idea of perfection, harvest decay and death from that nature. When we choose to do good over God, there's a break between me and God. When we're relying on a standard that is good enough, we cannot find him. You see, I'm not the standard. God is the standard. If the standard of white means that to remain white, it must be white and can accept no black dots, then good enough is never enough. He cannot be God and accept black dots. Flawless requires flawless in order to be in good relationship. Now, I want to go a step farther because here's the reality. Sin or missing the mark, accepting a standard that is even just good enough, it not only hurts our relationship with God, but it actually also hurts our relationship with each other. When it comes to standards, when it comes to a standard that is good enough, who is making that idea of what standard is good enough? You see, the problem is that everyone's standard of what good enough is different, and you know this. When you got married, your standard of good enough was different from your spouse's. When I got married, I had to actually learn that a laundry basket was actually meant to hold laundry. There was a standard that my wife had that I thought, hey, beside the laundry basket is pretty close. But there's a distinct difference. We all have different standards. What standard is good enough? The person you work for does not hold to the same standard that you do. The person you work for has a higher standard than what you usually do. The neighbor who moved in across the street from you probably has a different standard on what their yard should look like than what you have. The officer who pulled you over for speeding had a different standard than you had when you were driving. The guy who collected your taxes. Okay, we won't even go there. Whenever someone else's standard is put up against ours, there is a distinct difference, isn't there? The problem is that when we simply settle for our good standard, the reality is that it always will be in conflict with someone else's good standard. And when you do not measure up to someone else's good standard, what happens? I know none of you ever have experienced this, but if for some reason you do, if you do not measure up to someone else's good standard who has set a standard and expects you to live up to it, there is always conflict. Trust me, when that officer pulls you over and say, "Officer, I was only doing 20 over," and it's okay. It's good enough. And he's looking at you saying, "I don't think so." If you want to start arguing with him, there is going to be a problem and you are not going to win. You see, whenever we fail to measure up to someone else's standard, whenever we begin to make our standard to be the standard, the conflicts arise. Granted, we all know this. Sometimes we can make compromises. And we begin to go, okay, I will accept a compromise. And so the officer, as he's going there and he's writing us a ticket, the next time we're only going to do 10 miles over, right? We're going to compromise. We won't tell you about it, but I'll slow it down just a bit. But other times, hostility and breakdown of relationships are natural. So, to declare that you are a sinner, I know it's not nice. None of us like it. We would rather see ourselves as someone who simply makes a mistake or a bit of an oops. But yet, we all know this. There's something that lurks deeper inside of us. It causes me to sometimes say things to people I wish I wouldn't say. It sometimes causes me to get to a place where I refuse to ask forgiveness when I need to ask forgiveness. It tells me that I'm okay and that my standard was good enough and it's the other person's standard that was at fault. And we become happy with good. The problem with the sin is others see it in us, but we never see it in ourselves. Let's just kind of put it this way. We're going to close with this kind of idea. Sin is that thing that is in us that says, I am broken and I can't fix it by myself. It just doesn't happen. We need someone else to fix it. So, I want to give you 3 questions I want you to answer this week. I'm going to give you homework, okay? Take this, ask this with your spouse, talk about this with your kids. I think these are 3 fascinating questions that I would like for you to just stop and think about. Number 1, I want you to stop and think about, who is the best person you have ever met? Who is that one person when you say, now you talk about someone with a great standard, a good standard, who is that person? So I kind of just talk about it. We all have that one person we would like to be like. Who is it? Number 2, what is your greatest regret? I mean, there's something that lurks within us that causes us all to have regrets, doesn't it? I mean, all of us have said something, done something. What is your greatest regret? If you don't mind talking about it with someone, it's just kind of a fascinating thing to say, hey, I have this thing that, it's been one of my greatest regrets, and it's part of my life. And number 3, name a time when you worked to repair a mistake that you made. These are 3 simple questions. I just kind of, it's just to get your brain to think about this idea of what is the difference between a mistake and what is sin. What standard is good? What standard looks like God?